My name is Dr. Eleanor Blake, and at 44, I had spent the last 18 years perfecting something that would eventually become both my greatest achievement and my most devastating weapon. Not that I knew it at the time, of course. Back then, I was just the quiet woman in Lab 7, the one who arrived before dawn and left after the security guards started their evening rounds. The one whose desk was perpetually cluttered with molecular diagrams that looked like abstract art to everyone else. They called me the experiment girl behind my back. I knew because sound carries differently in empty hallways. And I had a habit of working late. The nickname wasn't entirely inaccurate. For nearly 2 decades at Veltrion Dynamics, I had been experimenting, tweaking, and refining an industrial adhesive formula that had become the backbone of our most lucrative contracts. Aerospace companies used it to bond critical components in aircraft engines. Construction firms relied on it for structural applications in skyscrapers. Defense contractors classified it as essential for military infrastructure. What they didn't know was that the formula existed nowhere but in my head and in the unconscious movements of my hands as I mixed each batch. I never wrote it down, not completely. Anyway. Oh, there were files in the system, specifications that looked official enough to satisfy the quality assurance team and impressive enough to show potential clients. But those documents were elaborate fiction, filled with plausible-sounding chemical ratios and processing temperatures that would produce nothing more than expensive paste. The real formula was a symphony of precise timing, temperature fluctuations, and additive sequences that I had memorized through thousands of repetitions. It lived in the muscle memory of my fingers, in the way I could detect the exact moment when the polymer chains reached optimal alignment by the subtle change in viscosity, in the almost imperceptible shift in color that indicated the catalytic reaction had peaked. This wasn't paranoia or some misguided attempt at job security. It was pure practicality. Industrial espionage was rampant in our field, and I had seen too many brilliant innovations stolen by competitors who managed to hack into supposedly secure databases. My formula was unhackable because it existed in the one place that couldn't be digitally breached: human intuition refined by years of practice. The irony wasn't lost on me that this same protectiveness would eventually become the instrument of Veltrion's destruction. Though I'm getting ahead of myself. The first sign that change was coming appeared on a Tuesday morning in March when I arrived at the lab to find my access card had been temporarily suspended for system updates. It took 3 calls to IT and 45 minutes of standing in the hallway before someone from security escorted me to my workspace. Small inconveniences like this had been multiplying over the past few months, each one accompanied by apologetic emails about infrastructure improvements and modernization initiatives. The real harbinger of change, however, was Travis Cole. Our new CEO had arrived 6 months earlier with the kind of MBA pedigree that made board members swoon and the kind of confidence that made experienced employees nervous. He was 32, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and spoke in management consultancy jargon that somehow managed to say nothing while sounding incredibly important. During his introductory presentation to the staff, he had used the phrase, optimize human capital, 14 times, I counted. Travis brought with him a new philosophy that he called generational renewal. In practice, this meant systematically identifying employees over 40 and finding creative ways to encourage their departure. The process was never explicitly stated as age discrimination, of course. Instead, it was framed as bringing fresh perspectives and leveraging emerging talent. Seasoned employees suddenly found themselves excluded from key meetings, their project assignments quietly redistributed to younger colleagues, their decades of institutional knowledge dismissed as legacy thinking. I watched it happen to others first. Martha from accounting, who could reconstruct 5 years of financial records from memory if the servers crashed, was offered an exciting opportunity to train a recent graduate in modern analytical techniques before accepting an early retirement package. David from engineering, whose understanding of materials stress had prevented countless structural failures, discovered that his position was being reimagined to focus on innovation-forward methodologies that somehow required a master's degree earned after 2020. The writing was on the wall. written in corporate newspeak and highlighted in millennial pink. So I began preparing, not by updating my resume or reaching out to headhunters, but by carefully and systematically purging every trace of my real work from Veltrian's systems. I deleted the authentic process notes I had kept as backup references. I corrupted the files containing actual temperature curves and timing protocols. I replaced genuine spectral analysis data with plausible but ultimately useless information. Every document that remained in the system after my cleanup looked legitimate, sounded scientific, and would lead anyone trying to follow it into a maze of productive dead ends. It was meticulous work that took weeks to complete properly. Each evening, after the last researcher had gone home, I would spend hours ensuring that my intellectual property could never be extracted from the corporate database. I told myself it was simply good sense, protecting work that represented half my professional life from being casually appropriated by whoever inherited my position. The call came on a Friday afternoon in April. Mila from Human Resources asked if I could stop by her office for a brief conversation about my career development trajectory. I knew immediately what this meant. After 18 years, my trajectory was about to intersect with the exit door. Mila's office had been redecorated since my last visit. Gone were the family photos and motivational posters, replaced by minimalist artwork and a small succulent garden that looked like it had been arranged by someone with a degree in feng shui. Mila herself seemed nervous, constantly adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting and avoiding direct eye contact. "Eleanor, thank you so much for making time," she began, her voice carrying the overly bright tone that HR professionals use when delivering unpleasant news. "As you know, Veltrian is undergoing some exciting changes as we position ourselves for the next phase of growth." Travis Cole was already seated at the small conference table, his laptop open and his expression carefully neutral. He nodded at me with the kind of smile that politicians use when meeting constituents they don't actually want to meet. "Dr. Blake," he said, "I want to start by expressing our genuine appreciation for your years of service. Your contributions to Veltrian's success have been significant." The pause before significant lasted just long enough to suggest that my contributions were being measured in past tense. As we move forward, Mila continued, taking over the practice duet. "We're implementing a comprehensive restructuring that will allow us to better align our human resources with our strategic objectives." I waited for them to finish their corporate poetry recital. The phrase comprehensive restructuring was particularly creative. It sounded so much more professional than "we're firing people to improve our profit margins." "We're prepared to offer you a very generous separation package," Travis said, sliding a folder across the table. "Additionally, we'd like to propose a brief transition period where you would help train your replacement. We believe this would ensure continuity of operations while providing valuable mentorship opportunities." This was the moment I had been anticipating. They wanted me to train someone else to do my job, presumably while handing over all the knowledge and expertise that made me valuable in the first place. It was a common request, and a revealing one. They had no idea that training my replacement would be like asking someone to teach a concert pianist to play a symphony by describing the music in words. "Who would I be training?" I asked, more out of curiosity than any intention to comply. "Kyle Brennan," Mila answered, consulting her notes. "He's a recent graduate from MIT with a focus on materials engineering, very bright, very eager. We think he represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that will drive Veltrian's future." I almost laughed. Kyle Brennan was 25 years old, brilliant in the way that recent graduates often are, and completely unprepared for the reality of industrial chemistry. I had met him during his brief stint as an intern the previous summer. He was the kind of engineer who believed that every problem could be solved with enough computational power and the right software. The idea that some knowledge couldn't be digitized or downloaded was foreign to him. "I appreciate the offer," I said, standing up and reaching for my employee badge. "But I don't think a transition period will be necessary." The silence that followed was pregnant with confusion. This wasn't part of their script. Departing employees were supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to ensure their life's work continued smoothly. They were supposed to be eager to share their knowledge and maintain their professional legacy. I placed my access card on the table between them, along with my company laptop and the set of keys to equipment lockers that I wouldn't be needing anymore. I'm sure Kyle will figure everything out, I said with a smile that I hoped conveyed more confidence than I felt. The documentation should be more than sufficient. Travis looked uncertain for the first time since I had entered the room. Are you sure we really would value your input during the transition? Completely sure, I replied, already moving toward the door. I wish you both the best of luck. And with that, I walked out of Veltrian Dynamics for what I assumed would be the last time. The next few weeks passed in a strange state of suspended animation. I'd been working continuously for so long that sudden unemployment felt like trying to breathe underwater. My small apartment in Portland seemed too quiet during the hours when I should have been in the lab, and I found myself unconsciously reaching for my phone to check work emails that would never come again. I used the time to catch up on scientific journals I'd been meaning to read, to organize years of personal research notes, and to consider what I might want to do next. Several former colleagues reached out with job leads, but none of them felt right. After spending nearly 2 decades perfecting one particular area of expertise, the prospect of starting over somewhere else felt overwhelming. What I didn't do was think about Veltrian or wonder how Kyle Brennan was managing in my old position. That would have been a waste of mental energy, and I had more productive ways to spend my time. It wasn't until 6 weeks later that I learned how spectacularly wrong that assumption had been. I was having lunch at a cafe near the university when my phone buzzed with a text from Liam Rodriguez, a former intern who had worked with me 3 years earlier and had since graduated to a position at Boeing. The message was brief but intriguing. Have you seen the news about Veltrian? Call me when you get a chance. A quick Google search revealed the first of what would become an avalanche of increasingly dire headlines. Structural failures plague. Major construction projects using Veltrian adhesives. Aerospace contractor grounds fleet following bond failures. Class action lawsuit filed against Veltrian Dynamics following bridge inspection crisis. The details were both fascinating and horrifying. Over the past month, adhesive bonds using Veltrian's flagship product had begun failing across multiple industries, not immediately, which might have been attributed to a bad batch or contaminated materials, but gradually, in a pattern that suggested fundamental problems with the chemical formulation itself. Concrete panels had separated from structural frameworks. Aircraft components had required emergency replacements. Military installations had suspended operations pending comprehensive safety reviews. The financial implications were staggering. Veltrian's stock price had dropped by 60% in 2 weeks. Emergency remediation costs were estimated in the hundreds of millions. Legal settlements would likely reach well into the billions. But what made the situation truly remarkable was the complete bafflement of Veltrian's technical team. According to the reports, company engineers insisted they had followed all documented procedures precisely. The chemical specifications matched historical standards. The manufacturing process had not changed, yet somehow, the fundamental properties of their adhesive had degraded to the point of uselessness. I called Liam back that evening. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Please tell me you saw this coming." "What do you mean?" "Come on. This can't be a coincidence. You leave, and 2 months later, their entire product line falls apart. There's no way that's random." I chose my words carefully. "I'm sure they have very thorough documentation of all their processes." "Right," Liam said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Very thorough documentation. Did you know there's already a subreddit called Gluegate? People are posting memes about it. Someone photoshopped Travis Cole's head onto the Titanic with the caption, 'I'm the king of adhesives.'" The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Liam updating me on the various theories circulating through industry networks about what had gone wrong. Some people suspected industrial sabotage, others believed it was a quality control failure. A few were beginning to suggest that Veltrian might have lost some crucial institutional knowledge when they restructured their technical staff. "You know what's really wild?" Liam said as we were wrapping up. "Kyle Brennan posted on LinkedIn last week claiming that you had deliberately sabotaged the documentation before you left. He's saying you gave them fake formulas to cover your tracks. This was interesting news, though not entirely surprising. When a high-profile project fails, the people responsible almost always look for someone else to blame. Kyle was young and probably panicking. Accusing me of sabotage was both predictable and, ironically, closer to the truth than he realized. "What does everyone think about that theory?" I asked. "Most people think he's trying to save his own career," Liam replied. "But there are a few folks who remember you being pretty secretive about your processes. They're starting to wonder if maybe you never documented everything as thoroughly as the company thought." After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and spent the evening reading through the growing collection of articles about Veltrian's crisis. The technical details were particularly enlightening. Kyle had apparently attempted to optimize my formula by substituting what he considered more modern chemical components and adjusting ratios based on computational modeling. The results had initially seemed promising, passing all the standard quality tests and even showing slight improvements in some performance metrics. But Kyle's understanding of polymer chemistry was purely theoretical. He had never learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated long-term instability, never developed the intuitive sense for how different additives would interact under varying environmental conditions. His optimized formula was like a beautiful house built on a foundation of sand. It looked perfect until the first heavy rain. As I read through the technical specifications that Veltrian had released in their desperate attempt to demonstrate transparency, I could see exactly where Kyle had gone wrong. He had misunderstood the purpose of several seemingly minor additives, treating them as optional refinements rather than essential stabilizers. He had adjusted processing temperatures based on energy efficiency calculations without considering their impact on molecular cross-linking. Most critically, he had attempted to accelerate the curing process to improve manufacturing throughput, not realizing that this would compromise the long-term integrity of the bonds. It was the kind of mistake that only someone with incomplete knowledge would make. Someone who understood the theory but not the practice. Someone who had access to documentation but not wisdom. I found myself feeling a mixture of satisfaction and genuine sympathy for Kyle. He was talented and well-intentioned, but he had been set up to fail by executives who believed that knowledge was just information that could be transferred from one person to another, like files copied between computers. The fact that my expertise was largely intuitive and experiential had never occurred to them. The wine was good, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. Watching a company that had discarded me struggle with the consequences of that decision seemed special enough. Over the following weeks, the Veltrian situation continued to deteriorate in ways that were both predictable and spectacular. Internal emails began leaking to industry publications, revealing a level of organizational chaos that bordered on comedy. Kyle had sent increasingly frantic messages to Travis and other executives, insisting that the formula documentation was incomplete or corrupted. Travis had responded with demands for immediate solutions and thinly veiled threats about accountability. The head of quality assurance had resigned rather than sign off on any more product releases. Meanwhile, Veltrian's legal team was fighting battles on multiple fronts. Construction companies were demanding compensation for emergency retrofitting costs. Aerospace contractors were threatening to terminate long-term supply agreements. Government agencies were launching investigations into safety violations. The company's insurance carriers were questioning whether policy terms covered failures caused by fundamental product defects. The technical challenges were proving even more intractable than the legal ones. Veltrian had hired a team of consulting chemists to analyze the failed adhesive samples and reverse engineer a solution. But understanding why something doesn't work is often much harder than understanding why it does, especially when the failure mode involves complex interactions between dozens of chemical components over extended time periods. I followed the coverage with the detached interest of someone watching a slow-motion disaster from a safe distance. There was a certain scientific fascination in observing how quickly a seemingly stable organization could unravel when its fundamental assumptions proved incorrect. Veltrian had built its entire business model around a product they didn't actually understand, created by a person whose knowledge they had dismissed as replaceable. The irony was so perfect it felt almost artificial. It was during this period of watching and waiting that I received an unexpected email from Dr. Felix Ward, my former graduate advisor and one of the most respected materials scientists in the country. Felix was 73 years old, officially retired from his position at Stanford, and unofficially involved in more cutting-edge research projects than most professors half his age. Eleanor, his message began. I've been following the news about your former employer with great interest and considerable amusement. I assume you're enjoying the show as much as I am. I hope you'll forgive an old man's presumption, but I have a proposition that I think might interest you. Felix went on to describe a new research institute he was helping to establish in partnership with several private investors. The organization would focus on advanced materials research with immediate commercial applications, but with a structure that prioritized long-term innovation over quarterly profits. Most importantly for my situation, intellectual property would be owned entirely by the individual researchers, not by the institution. We're looking for a few exceptional scientists who have been undervalued by traditional corporate environments, he wrote. People who have proven track records of innovation, but who might be interested in pursuing their work without the constraints of corporate bureaucracy. The compensation would be competitive, the resources would be extensive, and the creative freedom would be absolute. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I hadn't known I was waiting for. I called Felix the next day, and we talked for over an hour about his vision for the institute and how my expertise might fit into their research portfolio. By the end of the conversation, we had tentatively agreed that I would visit their facility in Northern California to see the operation firsthand and discuss specific project possibilities. The trip took place 2 weeks later, and I was impressed by everything I saw. The laboratories were state-of-the-art, the equipment was better than what I had access to at Veltrion, and the atmosphere was refreshingly collegial. Most importantly, Felix's commitment to researcher autonomy appeared to be genuine. Scientists working at the institute retained full control over their innovations and could pursue commercialization through whatever channels they preferred. What we're offering, Felix explained as we toured the main laboratory complex, is essentially the academic freedom of a university research position combined with the resources and focus of a corporate R&D division. You would have your own lab, your own budget, and complete authority over your research direction. The only requirement is that your work should have potential commercial applications within a reasonable timeframe. It was an offer I couldn't refuse, particularly given my current employment status and the growing certainty that Veltrion's ongoing crisis would make other companies wary of hiring their former employees. I officially joined the institute 6 weeks later, and within a month I'd begun the process of recreating my adhesive formula from scratch. But this time, I approached the work differently. Instead of simply reproducing what I had developed at Veltrion, I used the opportunity to address several limitations that had always bothered me about the original formulation. The new version would be stronger, more environmentally stable, and significantly more difficult to reverse engineer. I also designed it to be more sustainable, using bio-based components where possible and eliminating several toxic additives that had always made me uncomfortable. Most importantly, I built in several novel features that would make the adhesive uniquely valuable for emerging applications in renewable energy infrastructure and next-generation aerospace design. Working in my new laboratory felt like emerging from a long hibernation. For the first time in years, I was pursuing research purely for the intellectual satisfaction of solving interesting problems, rather than optimizing existing products to meet quarterly sales targets. The difference in creative energy was remarkable. It took me 4 months to perfect the new formula, which I decided to call Bondura 88, in honor of the year I had started my graduate studies. The properties exceeded even my optimistic projections. In head-to-head testing against the best adhesives currently available, including Veltrion's original product, Bondura 88 demonstrated superior performance in every relevant category. More satisfying than the technical achievements, however, was the knowledge that I finally owned my work completely. Every patent application would list my name as the inventor. Every commercial license would generate royalties that came directly to me. Every future development would be under my control. The contrast with my situation at Veltrion was stark and intentional. Felix suggested that we introduce Bondura 88 to the broader scientific community at the International Conference on Advanced Materials, which was scheduled to take place in Chicago 6 months later. It would be an ideal venue to demonstrate the capabilities of our new product while establishing the Institute's reputation as a serious player in materials research. I agreed, though I also had some private motivations for wanting to make the announcement at such a high-profile event. The conference would be attended by representatives from every major company in our industry, including whatever remained of Veltrian's technical team. It seemed appropriate that they should learn about my new work in the same public forum where they would be trying to convince potential customers that their problems had been solved. The months leading up to the conference were filled with additional testing, patent applications, and preliminary discussions with potential manufacturing partners. Felix proved to be as valuable a collaborator as he was a mentor, using his extensive network of industry contacts to generate interest in Bondura 88 before its official debut. By the time we arrived in Chicago, there was already considerable anticipation about our presentation. Word had leaked through various channels that a major breakthrough in adhesive technology was going to be announced, and several trade publications had published speculative articles about what this might mean for companies still struggling with product reliability issues. I had chosen my presentation title carefully. Next Generation Bonding Technologies Lessons from Failure and Foundations for Innovation. It was academic enough to sound scholarly, but pointed enough to ensure that anyone familiar with recent industry events would understand the subtext. The conference hall was packed. Felix introduced me with the kind of glowing biography that established speakers usually received, emphasizing my years of experience and my track record of successful innovations. He was careful not to mention Veltrion by name, but his description of my background made it clear that I had been responsible for some of the most widely used adhesive technologies in the market. I began my presentation with a brief overview of the theoretical challenges involved in creating adhesives for demanding applications. I discussed the importance of long-term stability, environmental resistance, and manufacturing consistency. I outlined the various ways that seemingly minor formulation changes could lead to catastrophic performance failures. The audience was attentive, but not particularly surprised by any of this information. These were technical professionals who understood the complexities of materials science. Then I began demonstrating the properties of Bondura 88. The test results were genuinely impressive, but what made the presentation memorable was the moment when I revealed the identity of the principal investigator. The slide appeared on screen with a simple statement: lead researcher Dr. Eleanor Blake, formerly of Veltrian Dynamics. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations erupted throughout the auditorium as people made connections between my departure from Veltrian and the subsequent failure of their products. Camera phones appeared as attendees began recording what they clearly recognized as a historic moment in industry politics. During the question and answer session, a reporter from Chemical and Engineering News asked the question that everyone was thinking: Dr. Blake, given the timing of your departure from Veltrian and the subsequent problems with their adhesive products, some people might characterize Bondura 88 as a revenge product. How would you respond to that characterization? I had anticipated this question and had prepared my answer carefully. I think that fundamentally misunderstands what scientific research is about, I replied. Revenge implies a desire to cause harm for personal satisfaction. What I've done is create a superior product that addresses real technical challenges and provides genuine value to customers. If that competition happens to be inconvenient for my former employer, that's simply how markets work. Felix leaned toward his microphone and added, I would characterize this as Dr. Blake's return to the scientific community, not as revenge against anyone. The goal was never to hurt Veltrian. The goal was to do better science. The presentation concluded to sustained applause, and the remainder of the conference was dominated by discussions about the implications of Bondura 88 for the broader adhesives market. Several potential customers approached me directly to discuss licensing opportunities. 2 major manufacturers expressed interest in exclusive distribution arrangements. 3 venture capital firms wanted to discuss funding opportunities for expanded production. But the most satisfying moment came during the final day of the conference, when I spotted Kyle Brennan in the exhibition hall. He looked older than his 26 years, and the confident enthusiasm I remembered from his internship had been replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had spent months dealing with an unsolvable crisis. Our eyes met across the crowded space, and I could see him working up the courage to approach me. When he finally did, his opening words were exactly what I had expected. "Dr. Blake," he said, "I need to ask you something directly. Did you deliberately leave us incomplete documentation when you left Veltrian Irasig?" I considered my response carefully. Kyle was young and had been placed in an impossible situation by executives who didn't understand the complexity of what they were asking him to do. His mistakes had been inevitable, given the circumstances. "Kyle," I said, "I left you exactly the same documentation that existed when I was there. The fact that it wasn't sufficient for your needs says something important about the nature of technical expertise, doesn't it?" He stared at me for a long moment, processing the implications of what I had just said. "So there never was complete documentation." "There was complete documentation of everything that could be documented," I replied. "But some kinds of knowledge can't be written down. They have to be learned through experience. Your former employers made the mistake of thinking that expertise was just information that could be transferred like files between computers." Kyle nodded slowly, and I could see understanding dawning in his expression. "So when they fired you, they fired the only person who actually knew how to make their most important product," I finished. "Everything else was just elaborate documentation of a process that no one else could actually perform." The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Kyle asking increasingly detailed questions about how the original formula had actually worked and why his modifications had led to such spectacular failures. I answered as honestly as I could without providing information that might help Veltrian recover from their current crisis. When he finally walked away, Kyle looked like someone who had just understood something fundamental about the difference between knowledge and information. It was a distinction that his former employers were undoubtedly learning as well, though at considerably greater cost. The aftermath of the Chicago conference exceeded even my optimistic expectations. Within 6 weeks, I had signed licensing agreements with 3 major manufacturers for different market segments. The financial terms were extraordinarily favorable, reflecting both the superior properties of Bandura 88 and the desperate need in the market for reliable adhesive technologies. Meanwhile, Veltrian's situation continued to deteriorate. The company had been forced to suspend all production of their flagship adhesive while they attempted to reformulate the product from scratch. Several major customers had terminated their contracts and were publicly announcing their intention to switch to alternative suppliers. The stock price had stabilized at roughly 15% of its pre-crisis value, and there were persistent rumors that the company was exploring bankruptcy protection. Travis Cole had been quietly removed as CEO 3 months earlier, though the press release had described his departure as a transition to pursue other opportunities. The new management team was led by a crisis specialist whose primary qualification seemed to be experience with corporate restructuring and asset liquidation. I followed these developments with the same detached interest I had maintained throughout the crisis, though I'll admit to a certain satisfaction when Forbes published an article titled "The $2 billion Mistake: How Veltrian Dynamics Fired the Foundation of Their Business." The piece included a detailed timeline of events and featured quotes from several industry experts who characterized my departure and Veltrian's subsequent troubles as a cautionary tale about the importance of retaining institutional knowledge. One particularly insightful comment came from a former Veltrian board member who spoke on condition of anonymity. "We thought we could replace experience with enthusiasm and institutional knowledge with documentation. It was the most expensive mistake in the company's history." The same article mentioned that I had declined to comment for the story, which was accurate. I saw no benefit in public gloating or detailed explanations of what had gone wrong. The facts spoke for themselves, and anything I might say would only feed speculation about my motivations. Felix, however, was more than happy to serve as a spokesperson for the broader implications of the situation. In interviews with several trade publications, he emphasized the importance of recognizing and valuing scientific expertise, particularly the kind of intuitive knowledge that develops over decades of hands-on experience. "What happened to Veltrian?" he told the editor of Industrial Chemistry Today, illustrates a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of innovation. Companies often treat their most experienced researchers as expensive legacy assets rather than irreplaceable resources. They assume that knowledge can be easily transferred or replaced, when in fact much of what makes a scientist truly valuable exists in forms that can't be captured in documentation or databases. He was careful to frame the discussion in terms of general principles, rather than specific criticism of Veltrien's management decisions. But the implications were unmistakable. As the one-year anniversary of my departure from Veltrien approached, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my professional situation had changed. I was now the principal investigator on 3 cutting-edge research projects, held patents on breakthrough technologies that were revolutionizing multiple industries, and had achieved a level of financial independence that I had never thought possible as a corporate researcher. More importantly, I was doing the most interesting work of my career. Without the constraints of corporate priorities and quarterly profit targets, I was free to pursue research directions that had always intrigued me but had never been commercially viable enough to justify development resources. The Institute provided exactly the kind of environment I had always wanted: serious scientific work with real-world applications. But driven by intellectual curiosity rather than marketing projections, the contrast with my final years at Veltrien was remarkable. Instead of spending my time optimizing existing products for marginal cost savings, I was developing entirely new approaches to materials science challenges. Instead of justifying every research expense to accountants who measured success in terms of immediate revenue impact, I was working with colleagues who understood that breakthrough innovations often require years of patient experimentation. It was the kind of professional satisfaction that I had almost forgotten was possible. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 1 year after my departure from Veltrien. Liam Rodriguez was calling with news that he thought I would find particularly interesting. "Eleanor," he said, "have you been following the Veltrien bankruptcy proceedings?" I had not been following them closely, though I was aware that the company had finally filed for Chapter 11 protection the previous month. "What's the latest development?" "They're being acquired by Meridian Chemical," Liam explained. "The interesting part is that the bankruptcy judge ordered a complete audit of Veltrien's intellectual property portfolio as part of the sale process. Guess what the auditors discovered?" I could guess, but I let him tell me. All of their adhesive formulation documentation was essentially worthless. The auditors hired an independent lab to try to reproduce their flagship product using the official specifications, and the results were completely inconsistent with the known properties of the original material. The judge actually used the phrase "elaborate fiction" in his ruling. This was fascinating news, though not entirely surprising. I'd always wondered whether anyone would ever bother to conduct a thorough technical review of the documentation I had left behind. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Meridian is basically getting the brand name and the customer list," Liam replied, "but they're having to start from scratch on product development. They've already announced that they're discontinuing the old adhesive line and focusing on next-generation alternatives." I assume they're aware of Bonder 88. "Oh, definitely. According to my sources, they've already reached out to Felix about licensing opportunities. You might be hearing from them soon." I thanked Liam for the update and hung up, feeling a mixture of vindication and amusement. The complete technical audit of Veltrien's intellectual property was the final confirmation that my approach had been both necessary and effective. I had successfully protected my work from appropriation while ensuring that the company couldn't simply replace me with someone younger and cheaper. The irony was that Veltrien might actually have survived if they had handled my departure differently. If they had offered me a consulting agreement to oversee the formula transition, or if they had asked me to train Kyle more comprehensively before leaving, or if they had simply acknowledged that my expertise was more complex than what could be captured in written documentation, the entire crisis might have been avoided. Instead, they had chosen to treat my knowledge as a commodity that could be transferred like inventory from one warehouse to another. The cost of that miscalculation was now approximately $2 billion in lost market value, legal settlements, and remediation expenses. Felix's prediction proved accurate, and I did hear from Meridian Chemical within 2 weeks of their acquisition of Veltrien's assets. Their initial licensing offer for Bondura 88 was generous, but I was in no hurry to make a decision. I had learned the value of maintaining control over my work, and any future partnership would need to respect that principle completely. The negotiations took several months to complete, but eventually we reached an agreement that provided Meridian with exclusive distribution rights for specific market segments while preserving my ownership of the underlying technology and my freedom to pursue research in related areas. The financial terms were extraordinary, reflecting both the superior performance of Bondura 88 and Meridian's urgent need to re-establish their position in the adhesives market. More satisfying than the financial success, however, was the recognition that followed. Within 18 months of leaving Veltrion, I had received the Materials Research Society's Innovation Award, been invited to deliver keynote presentations at 3 major international conferences, and been elected as a Fellow of the American Chemical Society. The scientific community had embraced me as someone who had successfully stood up to corporate short-sightedness and emerged stronger as a result. The final chapter of the Veltrion story came 2 years later, when Travis Cole published a business memoir titled Learning from Failure: Leadership Lessons from the Front Lines of Corporate Crisis. I bought a copy out of curiosity, wondering how he would characterize the events that had led to his downfall. His version of the story was predictably self-serving. According to Travis, Veltrion's problems had resulted from a combination of market pressures, regulatory changes, and inherited technical challenges that had proven more complex than initially understood. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, rather than the architect of a catastrophically misguided strategy. Most remarkably, he never mentioned me by name. In his telling, the adhesive formula problems had resulted from inadequate knowledge transfer protocols and insufficient documentation of legacy processes. He described the decision to restructure the technical staff as a necessary response to evolving market conditions, rather than an attempt to reduce labor costs by replacing experienced employees with recent graduates. It was exactly the kind of revisionist narrative I had expected from someone who had never understood the real causes of his company's failure. The book received mixed reviews and sold poorly, which was probably appropriate given the quality of the insights it contained. Several reviewers noted that Travis seemed remarkably uninterested in examining his own role in the events he described, preferring to focus on external factors and organizational systems rather than leadership decisions. One particularly pointed review in Harvard Business Review concluded, Cole's memoir reads like a case study in how executives can systematically destroy valuable institutional knowledge while convincing themselves they are implementing necessary reforms. His failure to acknowledge the human cost of his restructuring decisions or to recognize the irreplaceable nature of certain types of expertise suggests that he still doesn't understand what went wrong at Veltrion. I found that assessment both accurate and oddly satisfying. 3 years after leaving Veltrion, I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the Society for Human Resource Management about the strategic importance of knowledge retention in technical organizations. It was an unusual speaking opportunity for someone with my background, but the conference organizers were apparently interested in exploring how HR policies could either support or undermine long-term organizational capabilities. My presentation focused on the distinction between information and expertise, and how companies could better identify and protect critical knowledge assets. I used the Veltrion case study extensively, though I was careful to frame the discussion in terms of general principles rather than personal grievances. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several audience members commenting that the presentation had changed their perspective on talent management and succession planning. One HR director approached me afterward to say that she was planning to revise her company's policies around veteran employee transitions based on what she had learned during my talk. We've been treating experienced workers like they're expensive liabilities, she said. But you're right that some kinds of knowledge can't be easily replaced. We need to be much more thoughtful about how we handle transitions when key people leave. It was exactly the kind of reaction I'd hoped to generate. If my experience could help other companies avoid similar mistakes, then perhaps some good would come from Veltrion's expensive education in the value of institutional memory. Looking back now, 5 years after my departure from Veltrion Dynamics, I'm struck by how completely my professional life has been transformed. I run my own research laboratory, hold patents on technologies that are used in industries ranging from aerospace to renewable energy, and have achieved a level of scientific recognition that would have been impossible within the constraints of corporate employment. More importantly, I've learned to value my own expertise appropriately. For too many years, I had accepted the assumption that my knowledge was just one component of a larger organizational machine, valuable but replaceable if necessary. The Veltrian experience taught me that some kinds of expertise are genuinely irreplaceable, and that companies discount such knowledge at their own peril. The satisfying irony is that Veltrians attempt to optimize their human capital by replacing expensive experienced workers with cheaper recent graduates had exactly the opposite effect. Instead of reducing costs, they had destroyed their most valuable asset. Instead of improving efficiency, they had eliminated the foundation of their business model. Instead of positioning themselves for future growth, they had engineered their own obsolescence. None of this was intentional revenge on my part. I had simply protected my work and pursued new opportunities when the old ones were no longer available. The fact that this had led to catastrophic consequences for my former employer was a result of their own strategic mistakes, not any vindictive action on my part. Though I'll admit that watching those consequences unfold had been deeply satisfying in ways that I hadn't entirely expected. The most important lesson, however, isn't about corporate politics or personal vindication. It's about the nature of expertise itself, and the critical importance of recognizing and preserving the kinds of knowledge that can't be easily documented or transferred. In an economy increasingly dominated by information technology, it's easy to assume that all valuable knowledge can be digitized and distributed. The Veltrian case demonstrates how dangerous that assumption can be. Some expertise exists only in the minds and hands of the people who have developed it through years of patient practice. Companies that fail to recognize this reality, or that treat such expertise as an inconvenient legacy rather than a strategic asset, do so at their own considerable risk. I've learned to embrace that reality rather than apologize for it. My knowledge is valuable precisely because it can't be easily replaced or replicated. The companies that recognize this fact and structure their relationships accordingly will benefit from access to genuinely irreplaceable capabilities. Those that don't will eventually discover the true cost of their misconceptions. 5 years later, Bondura 88 has become the industry standard for high-performance adhesive applications, and I continue to develop even more advanced materials in my laboratory at the Institute. Travis Cole has moved on to a consulting career focused on helping companies navigate corporate restructuring. Though I understand his services are not in particularly high demand, Kyle Brennan has found a position at a small specialty chemical company where he is apparently doing excellent work on projects that better match his theoretical expertise. And sometimes, when I'm working late in my laboratory and the building is quiet around me, I think about that final meeting with Travis and Mila, when they had been so confident that my departure would be a smooth transition with no meaningful impact on their operations. They had assumed that knowledge was just information, that expertise was just documentation, that experience was just an expensive luxury they could no longer afford. They had been so very, very wrong. I smile when I remember placing my access card on that conference table, knowing what they didn't know about what they were losing. Not out of vindictiveness, but out of the simple satisfaction of being right about something important. Sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that operates independently of human intentions. Sometimes the consequences of poor decisions unfold with a precision that seems almost deliberate. Sometimes the quiet woman in Lab 7, the one they called the experiment girl, turns out to be the foundation that was holding everything together. And sometimes, when that foundation is removed carelessly, the entire structure comes tumbling down in ways that are both inevitable and magnificent to watch.